this conflict is perhaps not how it's portrayed in the press. The idea it's a genocide is very silly.
Israeli air attacks on Hamas-controlled Gaza has escalated in the last 24 hours. 5 days into the Israel-Hamas war, Gaza City lies in ruins.
That was impossible, and the numbers were outlandish. And then the Al-Aqli hospital bombing happened, where the world were claiming 500 dead from an Israeli airstrike, and it came out that it was 100 to 200 dead from a drop short. It's staggering because if you're looking at two sides in a conflict, they're only using the numbers of one, and the one they're using is the psychotic murdering terror group. It's absolutely beyond my comprehension. One thing Israel hasn't helped themselves with is the way they've completely blocked all journalists from everything. Those Hamas lists and those Hamas demographics are unreliable and shouldn't be platformed to the extent they are, and the Israeli ones are reliable and should be platformed more. I think the way the Israelis have run the information campaign hasn't been particularly helpful to their own cause and has done quite a bit of damage to their reputation internationally.
The war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas has stretched on for well over a year now. According to Gaza's Ministry of Health, well over 45,000 people in Gaza have died. But these death counts have been deeply controversial for as long as the conflict has been around. A new report by the Henry Jackson Society, a think tank, entitled Questionable Counting, analyzing the death toll from the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza, dives into that controversy over numbers and raises some questions about Gaza's Ministry of Health and the conflict death toll numbers that have been put out by this Ministry of Health. Andrew Fox is the author of that report. He's a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. He served for 16 years in the British Army and left the parachute regiment as a major. He has also been a defense lecturer and a commentator. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about your report. Could you begin by telling us a little bit about when you decided to carry out this study and some of the reasons that prompted you to carry out the study?
Yeah, well, when we were observing the start of the war in 2023, we realised that some of the numbers being reported were just an impossibility. The fact is, a war zone is a very chaotic place. When bombs are falling, you don't have someone there with a clipboard counting bodies, and yet the death rate coming out of Gaza was ticking over like a clock. So we realised that was impossible, and the numbers were outlandish. And then the Al-Aqli hospital bombing happened, where the world were claiming 500 dead from an Israeli airstrike, and it came out that it was 100 to 200 dead from a drop short Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket. So we knew there were problems here, and that's what set us off on this investigative journey to try and find something that resembles the truth.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Andrew. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the key findings of your report? You've talked about a number of problems in the death toll counts that have been put out by the Ministry of Health in Gaza. You're talking about adults being registered as children, disproportionate deaths of fighting age men, the inclusion of natural deaths into these death tolls, and also the world media underreporting Hamas terrorists being killed in these IDF strikes. Could you tell us a little bit about the key issues that you're raising in this report?
Which is, of course, Hamas. And the study that we worked with on this, they were called 50global. You can go to their website and see their full data. The way they looked at 1,400 media articles and found that 98% were platforming Hamas and 3% were platforming Israel. It's staggering because if you're looking at two sides in a conflict, they're only using the numbers of one. And the one they're using is the psychotic murdering terror group. It's absolutely beyond my comprehension why Hamas are considered in any way a credible commentator on this conflict when they have a vested interest in pushing out false numbers. And there's an argument that they've been accurate in previous conflicts, but we address that in our report as well and show that every conflict they've done They've tried to conceal fighter deaths, and they've even sent out instructions on Facebook to people in Gaza to hide the fighter deaths. So they haven't been reliable in previous conflicts, and the fact they're given so much credibility by the world's media is just baffling. I don't understand it, and it's morally wrong and completely appalling.
So, Andrew, despite the data provided by you, there are a number of international organizations, human rights groups, as well as media organizations across the globe that recognize the death toll numbers that are coming from the Health Ministry of Gaza as one of the few key sources of fatalities when it comes to the conflict in Gaza. How do you look at that?
I don't think there's anything to counter. I mean, it's simply a case of the same media laziness. I think one thing Israel hasn't helped themselves with is the way they've completely blocked all journalists from everything. I think that was a very foolish decision in some ways. I don't think there's a case that journalists should go into Gaza unsupervised. They'd only be killed or coerced, and it wouldn't achieve anything. But certainly they could have done a lot more of explanation of perhaps their targeting processes, as they have with me, to be fair, because they've taken veterans delegations, but not journalist delegations. So it's very strange. But the fact is that's created essentially a vortex that Hamas have filled. And so the only real data is out there. And we're not questioning the 45,000 total. That's absolutely not what we're doing in this paper. What we're questioning is the demographic breakdown, because of all the errors we found. You cannot say accurately men, women, and children. And then secondly, we're questioning the fact that nobody is citing the IDF's figures. And I think Times of Israel and Jerusalem Post have actually been pretty good at citing the IDF's figures as well. And that's the key point here. It's about balance in reporting.
So, Andrew, as per your findings, figures from Hamas-controlled organizations often appeared in around over 90% of the articles that you studied, often without scrutiny, as you say in your report. There are examples where the Israeli media itself has quoted the figures provided by the Gaza Health Ministry. So, if it's that widespread, how do you counter something like that?
I mean, look, there's a very basic point that you should, as a journalist, check your facts. I mean, I think we can agree on that, actually, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world. You shouldn't take things at face value, and really that's the issue with Western media. But yeah, I agree, and actually I've said this to Netanyahu himself. I met him in July, and I was with a delegation, and we made it very clear that actually the lack of information coming out of Israel was really hurting them on the international stage. And I think the biggest thing we had there was we had a general with us, General John McCall, who was former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of European Forces for NATO. And he was very against Israel on the flight out. He'd seen the same news coverage, the same numbers as everyone else. But then he sat down with the IDF and saw their rules of engagement and saw how they operated their targeting processes, and saw a variety of other things, and actually completely changed his mind. And the point he made to Netanyahu was, look, if it changes my mind, it's going to change other people's minds. Why not show the world? And I think they've been slightly better at that over the last couple of months, but it's way too late to start doing this 10, 11, 12 months into a war. So yeah, I think the way the Israelis have run the information campaign hasn't been particularly helpful to their own cause, and has done quite a bit of damage to their reputation internationally.
And if I could ask, are you blaming the Israeli government and saying that it's responsible in some senses for some of the information blackout surrounding what's happening in Gaza? Is the government of Benjamin Netanyahu itself responsible for the kind of data that's being published right now?
Yeah, of course. So the first thing was we looked at a period in October 2023 when the results, the numbers that were being pushed out were mathematically impossible. So, for example, on some days there were more women and children killed than were killed in the overall total. Some days they were claiming that no men had been killed at all. And of course, when you know Israeli targeting processes, that's nonsense. And this just speaks to my earlier point that if the Israelis were a bit more open about how they do this, people wouldn't invent stuff or misrepresent the numbers. So we knew that was impossible. We found men listed as women, mainly Mohammeds, and that was just over a dip sample rather than the complete list. So there will certainly be more of those. We found children on the list who were actually turned out to be adults, including a 31-year-old man who was listed as a 1-year-old child. We found cancer patients who'd been called forward for treatment outside of Gaza. And really, what this all points to is just a constant drumbeat of inaccuracy. It just shows you that there's just mistake after mistake after mistake on these lists. We also found that 26% of Gaza's population before the war was adult males. So if Israel was killing indiscriminately, you would expect to see roughly 26% of the dead being male by proportion. Actually, it's way in excess of that. It's at least 44% by the first reporting method. It's well into the 60% by the second, and it's nearly double in the third. And so what that shows is that men are disproportionately dying, and it's men of fighting age who are disproportionately dying as well. So we're seeing clear evidence that Israel is targeting fighters over innocent civilians. And then finally, we found that Hamas's previous reports were unreliable. And then we looked at the IDF's claims of 17 to 20,000 dead fighters. And we were roughly able to corroborate that with open source reporting. So that's the key findings of the report. And what it means is that those Hamas lists and those Hamas demographics are unreliable and shouldn't be platformed to the extent they are. And the Israeli ones are reliable and should be platformed more.
Andrew, a final question. Do you plan to send this report to the Israeli government? Do you have a sense of how they're going to look at it? Do you hope that the government looking at your report will reverse some of the information blackout that we've seen so far?
Yeah, I'm aware that the Prime Minister has seen it. I'm unaware of any action that's going to be taken off the back of it. What we do have is a campaign to get this in front of policymakers in both Washington, London, Brussels, and wherever in the world we can find a place to speak to people. And hopefully they will start to understand a little bit better that this conflict is perhaps not how it's portrayed in the press. The idea it's a genocide is very silly. And hopefully it will give people ammunition in their back pocket to counter some of the libels that you see about Israel. And in the meantime, I'm going to keep suggesting that Israel let more people in to see what's going on. Although it's very possible that ship has sailed and there's nothing that can really be done now to rescue the international information messaging.
Andrew, thank you so much for your time and for sitting down with India Today Global to explain your report and what it means for the conflict between Israel and Hamas over Gaza.